Now that we have some data injected into our JSX, I want to talk about another feature of JSX we're going to need if we're ever going to build anything meaningful with React. That is conditional rendering. Conditional rendering and conditional logic in general is at the very core of software development. If this, do that. If not, do something else. And the same is going to be true for our React interfaces. For example, is the user logged in? If they are, show the log out button. If they're not logged in, show the log in button. Has the user submitted the form with an error? If so, show an error message telling them how they can fix that form. If not, don't show them any error message. Now, to do this, we're once again going to be using our JavaScript expressions, which means that we're going to use the same conditional JavaScript features that we use in our regular programs. There is no strange new syntax or any sort of weird new behavior. We're going to be using the tools we've been using forever, like if statements. We're also going to be using ternary operators. And finally, we're going to take advantage of things like the logical and operator. And don't worry if you forget what any of these are or how they work. We are going to be covering all three techniques in this video. Now, this, once again, will be the thing you'll be modifying for the challenge. And down below, we're going to explore a little conditional rendering using the user profile example. Let's explore if statements first. Down below, I'm going to render template 2 as opposed to template, and that should show up our profile example. Here it is. So what we're going to do is use if statements to add a little bit of conditional logic right here. Instead of rendering the user location no matter what, we're going to first check if it even exists. If it does exist, we'll use it. So in this case, it would read location Philadelphia. If it doesn't exist, we're going to use a different value, like the static string unknown. So if there is no user location, this will read location unknown. Now we can't actually put an if statement right inside of here. This is a place for a JavaScript expression, not an if statement. So we need to work with expressions only. Now we can still use if statements. We're just going to move them into a separate function call, and we're going to call that function right here. And this is really critical to meaningful JSX. So let's go ahead and explore this feature by first creating a function. Now in 2 videos, you're going to learn all about ES6 arrow functions, how they work, why they're useful, and we're going to be using them throughout the rest of the course. If you already know what arrow functions are, bear with me for just one video as I use an ES5 function. Right here, I'm going to create a function. We're going to call this function something along the lines of getLocation, and this is going to return the location that should actually be used. Now in here, we can put whatever we want, including if statements. Down below, instead of getting the static user location property, what we're going to do is call this function, which is indeed just an expression. Calling a function is an expression. We're going to call getLocation, and the return value from getLocation, that is what's going to show up right here in the JSX. Now we already know that strings and numbers will indeed show up, so we can go ahead and return something like the string unknown. And that's the value that we're going to be using for people who do not have a location. Now with our code like this, we can go ahead and save app.js. Over inside of the browser, what do we get? We get location unknown. Now, currently, we don't have any conditional logic. We're always going to be rendering unknown no matter what, but we now have a pretty good setup for adding conditional logic in. So let's take getLocation to the next level by passing in the user.location property. If it exists, great. If it's undefined, that's fine too. We just want to go ahead and get the correct thing rendering right here. Now that means getLocation is going to take an argument, location, and we just passed that in. So at this point, we either have a string location or we have undefined if that property doesn't even exist on the user object. Now what are we going to do? We're just going to set up some if statements. If one thing will return one string, if another thing will return some other string. Let's kick things off by checking if. And right here, we're going to go ahead and check if location exists. If location. So if the location exists, we are going to return that location. We can return the location. If it doesn't exist inside of our else clause, what are we going to do? We're going to return that string we just set up. We're going to return the static string unknown. Perfect. Now we actually have some conditional logic in our program. If we save app.js at its current state, what's going to happen? Well, the location does exist. It is a valid string. It's going to get passed into getLocation, and the return value is going to show up. If we go through getLocation, we know we get the string here. We check if the string exists. A string with a length greater than 0 is a truthy value, so this condition would pass. This gets returned, and it shows up to the screen. Now, how do we trigger this case? Well, we just have a user with no location. So if I take this and I remove it, deleting the location property, as well as the comma for age, we can save the file. And this time around, we're actually going to see unknown instead of the location. So there we have it. We've added a little conditional logic into our program, and we did this using two tools. First up, we used the ability to call a function from our JavaScript expressions in JSX. And second up, we used the if statement to actually set up that conditional logic. Now let's imagine we wanted our app to function a little bit differently. Let's say, for example, if there is no location, we don't just want to render the text unknown. We want to actually hide the paragraph tag altogether. So we want to render the paragraph tag with the text if there is a location. Otherwise, we don't even want to show anything. Now, in order to do that, we're going to use the exact same tools. We're going to use function calls. We're going to use if statements, and we are going to return something based off of some conditional logic. Now, in order to actually do this, there's one really important thing we need to know about our JavaScript expressions in JSX. We already know we can use strings and numbers, and those will show up. We can actually also use other JSX expressions. So bear with me for a moment right here. Let's just go ahead and open and close a set of curly braces. If I typed in the number 1, 2, 3, we know what's going to happen. We're going to get 1, 2, 3 showing up to the screen. But we can actually also type a brand new JSX expression. For example, right here, I could add an h3 tag with some text. My h3. I can save app.js, and this is indeed going to show up. This is equivalent to removing those curly braces, but being able to add a JSX expression inside of those curly braces is really useful because that's going to allow us to set up getLocation to return a separate JSX expression. So let's play around with that. To kick things off, this paragraph tag, it's no longer going to sit right here. Instead, down below, we are going to have a single JavaScript expression that calls getLocation. And we will still pass in the user's location, user.location. Now we're going to actually remove this paragraph tag altogether. And up above, we're going to go ahead and tweak this. If there is no location, we don't want to do anything. If there is a location, we want to set up that paragraph tag once again. So right here, we can set up that brand new JSX expression. We are going to have our location, :space. Then we're going to inject the location value, and we already checked to ensure that it existed. So I'll create a JavaScript expression and inject location. Location is a string, and we know strings will show up. Now, what do we want to do if there is no location? Well, we can actually just return undefined. Now, undefined is implicitly returned if you don't explicitly return it. So this function can be simplified to this, which is identical. So getLocation returns one of two things. It returns a JSX expression if there is a location. It returns undefined if there is not. Let's go ahead and add the location back in, setting it equal to some value. We're going to save app.js, and right here we can see that location New York prints. We have our paragraph tag with the location : space followed by the actual value. Now if we go ahead and remove the location, what's going to happen? Well, we know one thing. We know that this returns undefined, but we don't know what happens when undefined is inside of a JavaScript expression in JSX. If we save app.js, we can take a look at this. Right here, nothing shows up. Not just nothing visible, nothing at all. So if I go into the elements panel and I get to that place, which is in this div, inside of our nested div right here, we have our h1, we have our first paragraph tag, and there's nothing else. There is no empty second paragraph tag or anything like that. So that brings us to the other value we can use inside of JSX, that is undefined. If one of your expressions resolves to undefined, nothing is going to show up, and that's actually a really useful feature. Now that we've used full function calls with if statements, let's go ahead and move on to the next technique, which is the ternary operator. And we're going to explore that technique by modifying this h1 right here. Currently, we show the user name. What we're going to do is add a little conditional logic. So if there is a username, we're still going to show it in the h1. If there isn't a username, we're still going to show the h1. We're just going to show a string anonymous instead. Now, we already know we could solve this problem by creating a function that returns one of two strings. But the great thing about the ternary operator is that it's a little more concise. We can explore the ternary operator real quick over in the Chrome console, and then we'll integrate it into our application. Let's just run through a quick example of its usage. So it starts off with a condition. The condition in our case could just be true, meaning that it always passes. Then we move on to the question mark. After the question mark, we provide the value we want this expression to resolve to if the condition is true. Now, it is true, it's static, so this value is always going to be used. We can type in the string Andrew, for example, or your name. Now, after that truthy value right here, we add a colon and we provide a value that we want to use if the condition does not pass. In our case, that's going to be the string anonymous. If we go ahead and run this, we can see which of the two values actually gets used. I run it and Andrew gets used. So if the condition passes, use this. If the condition doesn't pass, use this. That is the basic flow for the ternary operator. Now, if I use the up arrow key to reload that command and I switch true over to false, which of the two values is going to get used, anonymous is going to get used. Now, the great thing about the ternary operator is that it is an expression and not a statement, so we do not need to go ahead and break this out into a separate function call, for example. We can just add this little expression right in line. Let's go ahead and do just that over inside of Visual Studio Code. Right here, inside of our JavaScript expression, we're going to start off with our condition, which is to check if user.name exists. If it does exist, what do we want to have showing up in the h1? We want user.name. Now, if it does not exist after the colon, we still want to show something in the h1. It's just going to be a static string anonymous. Perfect. Now, if we go ahead and save this, the username is defined, so I would expect it to show up, and Andrew does indeed show up. But if I go ahead and remove this value and save app.js, we're now going to see that anonymous shows up, and this is exactly what we want. As you can see, the ternary operator is way more concise. It's not useful for every single situation, but it is a great tool to have in your tool belt. We're going to be using it quite a bit throughout the course in order to add conditional rendering into our JSX. Next up is the logical AND operator. Now, much like undefined, the Boolean values, true and false, and null, they're all ignored by JSX. So if I had the Boolean false right here, what would happen? If I save the file, nothing shows up. If I were to switch this to true, or I were to switch this to null, the exact same thing would be true. Undefined, null, and Booleans are ignored by JSX, and that is actually a very useful feature. So for the very last example, we're going to go ahead and tweak age right here, and we're going to do that using the logical AND operator. For our purposes, let's say that we only want to show this paragraph tag with the age information if the user's 18 or older. If they're a child, we're going to leave their personal information off of the profile. And we're going to do that obviously using a little conditional logic. So if they're over 18 or equal to 18, we'll show this paragraph. Otherwise, we don't want to show anything at all. Now, once again, could we use the function technique? Yes, but we're going to explore this new technique, which is just as concise as what we saw right here. So to do this, let's explore the logical AND operator first. And this is something you've definitely used inside of if statements, but there is some subtleties to it that you might not have seen that are actually going to come in handy for our purposes. So once again, we're going to use true and false, the static Booleans, to explore this. And we're just going to start off with our very first condition, just true. Now right here, we're going to add those two ampersands, and this is the logical AND operator. Now you've probably seen this in if statements. If one thing is true and another thing is true, then and only then do we want to run the code. If either of them are false, we don't want to run the code, and that's super useful. Let's go ahead and right here, type in a string though, and we're just going to have some age be our static string. Later on, this will be where we render the entire paragraph. If I run this, what happens? Well, the value sum age is what returns. So logical AND operators, if the first value is truthy, it is not going to actually use that. If the second value is truthy, that is going to get used. And that's exactly what we want here. So if the user is 18 or over, we will use the paragraph JSX. Now, what if the user is not 18 or older? So let's go ahead and tweak true over to false. When you use the logical AND operator and the first value is false, what happens? That value is the one that actually gets used. So it completely ignores the fact that this ever even exists, and false gets returned. Now we just explored that Booleans are ignored, which means that if the user is less than 18, false will be the value, and that's going to get ignored, and nothing is going to show up to the screen. So we can use these tools and tricks to add that conditional rendering in. Over inside of Visual Studio Code, we're going to do just that. I'm going to take this entire paragraph tag and cut it out, adding it to the clipboard, but removing it from the file. We're going to set up our JavaScript expression, and we're going to go ahead and kick things off with some sort of condition. We're going to check if the user age, if user.age is greater than, and in this case, we're going to see if they're greater than or equal to 18. If they are, great. We can set up the value we want to use. In this case, it's just that paragraph tag. I'm going to paste it in. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and save app.js and see what happens. The user is 26, so age 26 shows up. If I tweak it to something else though, like 17, we're going to see that the age place goes away completely. That paragraph tag never shows up because the user does not meet those qualifications. So the ternary operator is great for a condition where you want to do one of two things. The logical AND operator is for a condition where you just want to do one thing, else you want to do nothing at all. Now this currently doesn't check if the age exists at all, so we can make our condition a little more complex by wrapping it in parentheses. I'm going to add the closing parentheses after 18 and the opening right here. And we're going to check if user.age even exists, and then we're going to check its value. So if there is no age, we obviously don't want to show the age, but if there is an age and it's not greater than or equal to 18, we also don't want to show that information. So now we actually have things set up to have an empty user object. I could go ahead and pass in the empty object, save the file, anonymous shows up, we get no age, we get no location, everything is working as expected. As we add that information in though, the profile is going to get populated, it is going to show us exactly what we would expect. So I'm going to add my name back to Andrew, my age back to 26, and my location back to Philadelphia. And I should see all of that information showing up because all of the conditions are indeed passing. So there we have it. Those are the three techniques that we're going to use. Now at this point, we just know that they exist. We haven't really explored a ton of real world examples, so don't get too worried if it's not 100% clear exactly why you would use one over the other. We're going to be doing a ton of conditional rendering in the course, and you will get lots of hands-on experience with all three techniques. For now though, let's move on to the challenge where you're going to use some of these tools to add some conditional rendering to our first template example up above. First up, you're going to go ahead and only render the subtitle and the p tag around the subtitle if the subtitle actually exists. If subtitle exists, and to do this, we can go ahead and use the logical AND operator. Based off of some condition, we want to show one thing, otherwise we want to show nothing. So we'll use the logical AND operator for that guy. Next up, what I'd like you to do is create a brand new property on app, which we can actually just do right now together. So right here, we're going to add on options. Now options is going to be an array of string options, and eventually we'll use this array to generate our list dynamically, but we're not going to worry about that for the moment. We'll talk about arrays later in this section. For now, we're just going to go ahead and add a couple of options in. 1 and 2. So the second thing I'd like you to do is conditionally render a brand new paragraph tag. So render new p tag, and you're going to set the text based off of whether or not there are items in that array. If options.length is greater than 0, you can use a message like, here are your options. And if it is not greater than 0, you can go ahead and use a message like no options. So that's going to be a brand new paragraph tag, and you can put that brand new paragraph tag right here below the subtitle. And remember, this paragraph tag always shows up. It is the text value that changes. And for this one, we have a condition and we want to use one of two values. So the ternary operator would be a great fit. Remember, you're going to use the length property on the options array in order to get that length back. So take some time to knock this out, getting both conditions set up, then change the app object, remove all of the items to make sure the message changes, and remove subtitle to make sure that paragraph tag goes away. And when you're done, you can go ahead and click play. All right, hopefully you were able to get that one done. Right here, we have our first one. We want to hide this paragraph tag completely if there is no subtitle. And I mentioned we're going to use the logical and operator. So I can cut it out, add my JavaScript, and set up that condition. In our case, we're going to check if app.subtitle exists. If it does, that's great. We can add our logical and operator, and we can set up our paragraph tag. If it doesn't, this will resolve to false, and the subtitle paragraph tag will not show up. Now we can go ahead and add the second one right here. We're going to set up that p tag. This p tag always exists, which is why it's not part of the condition. It is the text value that is. So I'll add a JavaScript expression right inside of here. And we're going to go ahead and set up that ternary operator. First up is our condition. We want to check if app.options.length is greater than 0. If it is greater than 0, we're going to use one message. I'll stick with single quotes. If it's not greater than 0, we're going to use another message. The message for a length greater than 0 is here are your options. And the message for a length of 0 is going to be no options. Now we can go ahead and actually render template instead of template2, and we can make sure everything works as expected. If I save app.js, we should see the subtitle. We are, and we should see our message. Here are your options. We are seeing those. Let's go ahead and actually tweak the data. I'm going to remove the subtitle, and I'm going to empty out the array, deleting all 2 items. If I save app.js, now we can check our conditional rendering, and here we have no subtitle, which is correct, and we have our message no options showing up in the paragraph tag, also correct. So hopefully you were able to get that done. I am going to undo those changes and save the file once again, bringing our app object back to the way it was in the beginning. We can now go ahead and remove this. As always, you can feel free to leave around any comments. You can also feel free to remove them. That really is up to you. I'm going to go ahead and clean them up though, so they're not taking up space in this file. And there we have it. We've explored the basics of conditional rendering, a technique we will use over and over again throughout the course. So for now, don't worry too much about mastering all 3 strategies. We're going to be putting them into practice quite a bit. Let's go ahead and continue on to the next 2 videos where we're going to learn about a few ES6 features that are going to make life a whole lot nicer.